Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on A Better Europe for Young People, What Matters Most. My name is Elisa Lironi, and I will be the moderator of the session today. I'm the Program Director on European Democracy for the European Citizen Action Service. It is a Brussels-based NGO that has been for more than 30 years empowering citizens to exercise their rights. As I said, today I will be moderating this live webinar, and we have some very interesting experts that will be digging deeper into issues such as young people's expectations of the EU, especially this year, which is the 2022 European Year of Youth. We will also be debating about youth participation initiatives, young people's trust in society, and discussing current affairs such as young people's perceptions of the war in Ukraine, for example, but also the impact of COVID-19, especially on youth employment. This webinar is an opportunity for you as participants to interact with our experts today. And we are looking forward to a debate on policy solutions for a just and inclusive society and recovery. We would love to interact with you around what works in youth interventions, especially on the issue of employment. The goal today is to come forward with solutions on how EU decision makers can put young generations at the center of EU policies and ensure that all youth priorities are included in all EU decision-making processes. So now I would like to invite you simply that if you would like to have an intervention, if you have some solutions in mind, but especially if you have questions for all of our speakers, to just use the online chat that you have at your disposal. I will be making sure to get those questions and just indicate if you have a specific expert that you would like to address the question to. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you to the speakers and experts today. First of all, Biljana Sirakova, EU Youth Coordinator of the European Commission. Then we have Massimiliano Mascherini, Head of Unit Social Policies of Eurofound. Susana Puerto, Senior Youth Employment Specialist of the International Labour Organization. And last but not least, Manon Dee, who will be giving us an interaction to the speakers that you hear today, as she is the Policy Officer for Social and Economic Inclusion of the European Youth Forum. So let's start immediately with our first speaker, who will be giving us some insights on how to ensure a better Europe for young people. Biljana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you, with our wonderful speakers and the online audience. I just want to start by saying a big thank you to Eurofound for initiating this webinar. And also we are very happy to have here the International Labour Organization. So I will share with you a presentation linked to specifically the perspectives that we have from a recent Eurobarometer on youth and democracy in the European Year of Youth. And we'll be happy to, of course, take questions and participate in the discussion. So we know what matters to young people. Firstly, a few years ago, a large population of young people told us that, and the 11 youth goals were developed. And I will not go into details, and I think many of you know that young people, of course, care about things like quality employment, quality learning, mental health, etc. So we have these 11 goals, which is the vision of young people, what do they want for them in Europe. But of course, we have to check the situation. The context has been changing, especially in the last 2.5 years. It has changed drastically. And this is why we continue to have different surveys and to establish what would have been these changes, what is the impact. And this is what we'll be discussing today. So I will give the perspective from this Eurobarometer, which we recently ran, was requested by the Director General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture. And it was conducted between end of February and March of this year, so very recent. And we had more than 26,000 young people, 15 to 30 EU citizens who took part in this survey. And when you get our materials, you'll be able to have the link to the full report and information, including country information. So this survey touched upon 5 major topics: the youth's view on the European Year of Youth, youth participation in civic life, participation in activities in other countries, and awareness of the EU youth offer and youth expectations from the EU. Given that I have another 6 minutes or something like that, I will just concentrate on a few of these things. But just to give you really in one slide, the 3 top kind of key findings from this Eurobarometer. The first one is that mental and physical health, environment, education, and fighting inequalities are the top priorities for young people. And we have seen this in a number of other studies, but there are national differences in terms of what is most important for young people in a given country, and I'll discuss those. Then young people are increasingly engaged, but still there is a lot more to do. And here we see that it's the awareness raising and education is key. And then thirdly, young people do want to participate in decision-making processes and want to have a say. And they're finding also innovative ways to do that. So that's something that we see as well. So let's dig deeper into these areas. So one of the questions that we asked in this survey was, what do you want? Do you think the European Year of Youth 2022 should focus on? What should be the key themes? And hopefully you can see here, and if not, try to expand maybe the screen a little bit, the key themes. So we see that improving mental health and physical health and well-being is the biggest priority in 16 of the member states. So where you see these orange highlights, this is the most frequently selected response. And so this is something that's really on the top of young people's mind in the majority of the member states. However, you can see maybe here that there is a big variance from one country to another. For instance, in Germany, this is the top priority for 26% of the respondents, where in some countries such as Estonia, it is quite high, it's 56%. The second thing that we see, if you follow where there are most of these orange highlights, is fighting poverty and economic and social inequalities. So some of the countries where this is really the top priority, an issue is Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, and Greece. And you can see that in other countries as well, this is quite something that young people are worried about. Protecting the environment and fighting climate change, you can see as well. And then improving education and training remains quite high on the agenda as well. So in terms of the different factors that have an influence here, what is noticeable that there is not a big difference in terms of age. This is what was checked for. However, when it comes to educational background, this was asked just for the people who have completed their education. Young people who have higher level of education are more likely than their lower educated peers to select as priority all of these topics, but this is especially true for environment. So for instance, for environment, 38% of those with post-secondary or higher education find the environment should be a priority of the European Year of Youth. And when we look at those who are with secondary education or lower, this percentage is 29%. So education is one of the factors here. So I will go to the next topic, which is young people's engagement. And here I'm sharing a table where I have compared the statistics to previous years, because we've asked the same question in the last 12 months. Have you participated in any of these activities previously? And what we see, this green line, is that young people, fewer and fewer young people are not engaged. So basically young people are becoming more engaged. So now only 39% of them have not participated in the last 12 months in any of these activities. So this is quite positive in terms of the trend. However, you can see that there is still a lot to do, because there is the majority of young people are not active. Then we can look at the reasons why this is happening. And you can see here that the top reason is still that people don't have time. This is for 39%. However, there are some that where we can discuss what can be done, because we see that, still a big percentage of people have not thought about it, or they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to be active in the society, or they don't understand the issues enough, or importantly, 22% say that nobody has ever asked or invited them to take part. So this is something I think that we have to think about. Moving on to the next information here is this question that we asked, what are the most effective actions for making young people's voices heard by decision makers? And voting, which sometimes we think that is really on decline, it still remains the most effective way, at least how young people perceive it, to have an influence. And voting in 19 of the member states is considered the most effective way to do that. However, again, there's big variation. This is varying from 26% in Latvia to 54% in Portugal. In terms of these most effective ways to have a say, there's no big gender differences. In this survey, I have to say, the question that was measured was gender, and the options were just male and female. And of course, it's a part of a bigger discussion why that was the case, but this is how the report was done. And so females perceive voting and volunteering, participating in youth organization as more effective than males, but it's not a huge difference. Then what we can say when it comes to age, especially when we compare the oldest and youngest of the age groups, older young people, 25 to 30, are more likely to believe in voting. But when you compare to the younger people, they think that the most effective is actually taking part in youth and student organizations. And in terms of work or different here status, there was no particular difference. So then there was a whole section, as I said, where we asked young people what do they expect from the European Year of Youth. And here something very clearly emerged, that young people would like to, that society and decision makers listen to them more and act on their demands. I will not go into, you can see here the different options, but again, just to comment briefly on some other factors. Here again, young women were more likely to expect most of these outcomes compared to males. For instance, 36% of female respondents expect society and decision makers to listen more, where for males, this is 29%. When it comes to age, here there is not a big difference. It's very minor, but this is where there is a difference when it comes to education. So when young people have higher level of education, their expectations are stronger. So, for instance, 36% expect society to listen more in decision makers, and for those who are with lower education, it's 27%. Then here you can see as well in terms of the kind of country breakdown, but I will move along for the interest of the time. And of course, in the second half, when we have more time for a discussion, we can maybe revisit some of these. But you can clearly see all the orange lines that in really many countries, this is the top option that was selected. And final, I believe here is, because it is linked to the next presentation, this question on what do young people think should be the policy measures that can mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on youth. And you can see that, I mean, in 19 out of the 27 member states, actually the largest share of young people consider, again, psychological health, including non-medical health, providing support, mental health to mental health problems, the most effective measure for mitigating the effect of COVID-19. So I would be missing if I do not have one slide to just point you to where you can find more information about the European Year of Youth, because I did mention it a lot. So here are some links, and I will stop here. And thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Biljana, for this first presentation and for showing us the data from the Eurobarometer, which is very interesting. I hope that there will be some questions from the participants to dig deeper into the statistics that you have shown us. But as you've said, you have made a very beautiful transition to our next speaker, Massimiliano, who will be actually telling us a bit more about how to mitigate, for example, effects of the COVID-19 on youth. As you've mentioned, Biliana, mental health and physical health are the top priorities of the EU. And we're looking forward to hearing from Massimiliano the research that he has done also on these on the effect of COVID-19 on young people. So Massimiliano, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Elisa, and thanks a lot, Biliana. It was very interesting to hear your presentation and on the needs and the participation of young people after a big crisis like COVID-19 and in the middle of a new crisis, actually, that we live with the Ukrainian war. So I have prepared a short presentation regarding the impact of COVID-19 on young people. So to start, actually, what was COVID-19, actually? The COVID-19 crisis that started in March 2020 started as an health crisis, but quickly became an economic and a social crisis. So it's like a modern Kerberos, the three-headed hound, guardian of the Haid of the Greek mythology. Actually, this beast actually had three heads, and it's like our COVID crisis: one health crisis and an economic and social crisis altogether. And these three heads, actually, of this monster basically affected differently the various socio-demographic group of our society. We know that the health crisis affected more older people, while a younger generation and the women, and especially young women, were more exposed to the wider consequences of the economic and social crisis. And in particular, focusing on young people, actually, young people, the COVID-19 had a multidimensional impact on youth, actually. While young people were more resilient to the COVID-19 disease, they were more vulnerable to the economic and social implication of the non-restrictive, the restrictive measures put in place by governments in order to try to control the virus. And in particular, young people were affected in terms of employment participation, education, social capital, and then mental health, as you mentioned. So in my presentation now, I will discuss a bit employment, health, and a bit of social capital, actually, and then I'm open to questions for the other dimensions. So if we start with employment, the 2008 crisis shown that the additional vulnerability of young people regarding labor market participation. We know that youth unemployment exploded during the 2008 crisis. So when this crisis started, the question was, is history going to repeat itself again, actually? The answer is yes and no. So the impact of COVID-19 was very different. In 2020, when the COVID-19 crisis arrived, youth was hit the hardest. Employment rate decreased for young people of 2.1%, and this reduction was quite more limited for the other age group, and for older groups, actually, it increased their employment participation. But then in 2021. Employment participation of young people increased a lot, 1.3% actually, so was quite big. And this was the results of all the measures put in place by the European Commission and by the member states in order to have a quick and strong recovery. This yes and no picture actually is also shown if we look at unemployment. In fact, if we see the dynamic of unemployment of youth unemployment during the 2008 crisis, we see that from the beginning of the crisis, youth unemployment increased, and after 25 months of the 2008 crisis, youth unemployment was 7% higher than the pre-crisis scenario. It's a totally different picture, the one that we have with COVID-19. It increased sharply in the first 5 months of the crisis, and then it started to decrease, and decreased quite strongly. And after 19 months since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, youth unemployment reached the pre-crisis scenario, and now is navigating around 1% below the pre-crisis scenario. So here we see the effectiveness of the policy response that member states and the EU has implemented during the COVID-19 crisis. However, it's not just employment. Mental health is a big issue, as Biljana said. Usually, young people always revealed better mental well-being than older groups. With the COVID-19, this has reverted. As we see here in the graph, this is just one simple indicator, the feeling of depression. Youth recorded a higher share than the general population. So the share of people that felt depressed was always higher than the general population during the COVID-19 crisis. And this is a novelty. It was always the opposite. One of the drivers of this was the lockdown and the restrictive measures put in place. We have analyzed the impact of non-pharmaceutical intervention on mental well-being, and we found that while international travel bans and restriction on gatherings had a negative impact on mental well-being of all the population, school closures and the stay-at-home requirement had a specific negative impact only on young people. And so it is quite important to, in the future, to implement non-pharmaceutical interventions very carefully in order to do not leave traces and to do not impact mental well-being so hard as it was happened in the first 2 years of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, despite all this storm, young people has more trust from in comparison to the rest of the population. Here is what is gets along in the literature. Always young people had a higher level of trust in institution than the rest of the population. This is confirmed also during the COVID-19, and this is great, actually. In general, the European Union has scored higher than trust in government. So trust in the EU is higher than trust in government. However, as we can see from the graph, in spring 2022, actually, there is a decrease in trust in the EU and in trust in governments. And this is very important to reflect about this because in spring 2022, the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we are now with the war at our doorstep. In terms of perception on the war in Ukraine, we see that young people appear to have a lower level of concern regarding the war in comparison to older generation. Maybe because older people are those that live more closely to the implication and consequences of World War II, for example, but there is quite some differences in the level of concern regarding the war. However, young people have a high level of support towards the European Union initiatives and government initiatives to support Ukraine, from supporting refugees to donating material, as well as military and sanctions. This level of support is in line, but a bit slightly lower than the rest of the population. What is important is young people have been personally involved in donating material aid and donating money. Almost 40% actually donated or expressed the intention of donating material aid to support refugees and Ukraine, actually, from a personal perspective. Now, I started with the Kerberos, and I will conclude with Hercules or Heracles in the Greek mythology. Because we need, it was a three-headed crisis, we need a holistic approach in order to sort it out, as Heracles did in order to defeat Kerberos. How he did it? He didn't fight one head at once, he took it from his throat. So he had an holistic approach, and an holistic approach is probably what we need in order to integrate young people in labor market and in our society. Time is up, so thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy for answer to some questions later in the question and answer. Thanks a lot, and Elisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. I think that it was very interesting to hear about the health, social, and economic implications on youth. And I think that what we've heard is quite worrying in some sorts. And I hope that we will be also talking about the solutions and, all of the mental implications due to the restrictions. And also, it was interesting for me to see the difference of trust going up and down depending on external circumstances as well. So I hope that we will have more questions actually from the audience. I really encourage the participants to post your questions to these experts in the chat so that I can relay them back to them. And now moving forward with our next speaker, Massimiliano has also mentioned the problem of unemployment. And we would love to hear now from Susanna, who will be talking more about the impact of COVID-19 and the latest in terms of the recovery and what it means for the labor markets. All of these trends of insecure jobs, long-term impacts of being unemployed. Susanna, the floor is yours to tell us your insight about how we can mitigate these effects on youth.
Thank you, Elisa, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we have heard from Biliana and Masi about the situation of young people in Europe, as well as their perspectives around key issues from trust, unemployment to the war in Ukraine. So let me add to this conversation with a global picture so that we can place Europe's realities vis-a-vis the complex issues that are affecting young people today. As Masi said, COVID-19 did stop, and I will add, stop or reversed any progress achieved over the past years on youth employment. And while young people are always heavily impacted by economic recessions, this time the impact was immediate and it was severe on young people. Our first measures of the impact were from April and May of 2020, when we saw a global trend of first disruptions in education and training. We actually, through our surveys, captured that 1 in 8 young students across the globe were left without any access to courses. In difference to the alternative learning measures that we experience in Europe, the inequalities linked to the digital divide truly manifested among young people in lower income countries. They could simply not access school, and globally, they also reported having learned 65% of them reported having learned less than before the pandemic. The second thing we found was that clearly there was a vast disruption in employment. At least 1 in 6 young people stopped working with the outbreak of the coronavirus. And most of them were younger workers aged 18 to 24 who were engaged in clerical work or support activities, services, sales, crafts. They were hardly affected by the job lost. And the last effect, as it was mentioned before, it is an effect on the mental well-being of young people. So this is a global issue. It is not unique to European youth. And in fact, we found that in 2020, 17% of young people were probably affected by anxiety and depression. This was particularly the case of young women and the younger youth. So when we look at the state of labor markets today, 2 years after the onset of the pandemic, we find a trail of damage in youth labor markets. In some countries, it is subtle. In others, the triple shock of education, employment, and mental well-being truly hides what could become a protracted youth employment crisis. Today, over 30 million jobs held by young people disappear between 2019 and 2020. Now we can, we can see that from the information we have nowadays. This job loss is equivalent to a reduction in youth employment by 8.2%, which is massive compared to the situation of adults, whose employment rate fell by 3.6% in 2020. Young women have been shouldering the worst of the employment crisis. Roughly 2 times as many young women lost their jobs as did young men. Many of them, or of those young people who lost their jobs, they went back to school. Maybe the case for many of the young people who are listening to this webinar. Yet, a vast number of them also became inactive. So it meant that losing a job didn't only mean that you became unemployed, it also means that a lot of young people simply stop looking for jobs. So they enlarge the lines of the youth that are not in employment, education, or training. The ILO will soon publish the latest global employment trends for youth, but I can already tell you that we have hit a record high with over 280 million youth who are not in employment, education, and training. This is important, and I hope we can reflect more about this during the conversation. Yet, it is important also to bear in mind that the Youth Employment Challenge is not only about entry barriers or inactivity, it is also a challenge of work quality. The pandemic has widened inequalities and pushed young people, particularly young workers, into greater work insecurity. So at the end of the day, what we have is a situation where unemployment, inactivity, and insecure work could lead to long-lasting scarring effects in career paths and future earnings of youth. Unless these vulnerabilities are addressed and unless the mental well-being of young people is protected, the social risk of a COVID-19 lockdown generation may be felt in the long term. So there is, without a doubt, an urgent need for immediate action to reverse the negatives and to accelerate the recovery, which is now certainly hampered by the conflict in Ukraine, the disruptions in global supply chains, and of course, the inflationary circumstances we live in today. As we turn now to young people for ideas, as we turn now to the European Youth Forum, I want you to keep in mind three things. First, we need to boost the participation of young women in the labor market. How can we do that? Skills, definitely. What else? As someone said to me this week, think global, work local. So I urge you to think about those sectors with potential to boost employment opportunities, particularly for young women. For example, the care economy. The care economy employs a large proportion of women, including domestic workers. So let's explore how, through skills and by improving the working conditions in the care economy, young women and young workers can benefit. Similar opportunities can emerge from the green and digital economies. So let's explore, how to bring young women back into the labor market. The second thing I want you to explore and to think about is how are we going to address the mental well-being of young workers and young aspiring workers? Psychosocial support for young people, as well as spaces for you to build resilience and the feeling of belonging are no longer an option or an optional component of youth employment policies and programs. So let's truly think about how our interventions, our actions, our investments as governments or NGOs or practitioners truly can have an effect in improving the mental well-being of young people. And the last thing that I want you to think about is about the rights. And I'm sure you have all heard the argument that any job is better than no job. But I'm equally sure this audience knows all too well that a low-paid, dangerous, demeaning job can all too easily become a trap from which people never escape. There is plenty of evidence that improving working conditions can go hand in hand with increased productivity. So, how can we enhance the quality of jobs for young people? That is my third question to you. And I hope from this dialogue we can truly come together with new solutions and new ideas, innovations on how we can advance decent jobs for youth. Thanks, Elisa, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. This was very, very insightful, and I actually took notes of all of the things that you were saying. And I think that what struck me the most was to see how 1 in 8 students were actually left without courses, or the problem of the digital divide. And as a digital democracy expert myself, I would have loved to ask you more about, the digital divide and what did we see? What was actually the main problem of inclusion of young people when using technologies as well? And also, it was quite gloomy to hear about the effects also on mental health. And I hope that we'll have also more questions from the participants around these topics. And thank you very much for also wrapping up with these three very important points about the participation, especially of young women, and also how to have sustainable long-term solutions on the effects of health for young workers, and of course about rights and working conditions that can actually increase productivity. So now I will pass it over immediately to Manon, who is the representative of the European Youth Forum. And we would love to hear from you, Manon, your reactions to these three speakers, their data, their research, and also their conclusions and some solutions that they've proposed. From your side, from the European Youth Forum, what would you like to say as a reaction to these, and how can we ensure better life standards for young people?
Well, thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you so much to the previous experts also for really setting the scene on the situation that young people are facing currently. It was really interesting to hear, for example, from the Eurobarometer, the interest of young people in being involved in the decision making, especially related to the European Year of Youth. That's something that we really hear also from the membership of the Youth Forum. And we also very much concur with the different analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on young people. We ourselves have done a research that was really focused on the young people, of course, which is called Beyond Lockdown, the Pandemic Scar on Young People. That is based actually on ILO data that Susanna was presenting. So this is all very much something that we would agree with, and that's been part of the work we were doing. And our role as the European Youth Forum, representing so many youth organizations and therefore young people voices, is really to bring those voices and the solutions that are needed to make sure that young people, will not suffer from what we call this pandemic scar that would have extremely long-term effects on them. In terms of really, what solutions are needed there, which I think is the core of the issue there. We need both comprehensive measures, holistic measures, what Massimiliano was saying with the comparison to Heracles, and also more targeted ones, of course, because we've identified very more targeting measures that have impact in young people. Maybe for setting the scene there also on my side, we recognize very much the work that has been done already at the European level and the member states level, even though, of course, it took some time at the very beginning, at the onset of the pandemic. There were then a lot of measures that were taken, many of them trying to target specifically young people, which is what is needed in those situations. So, of course, for the RRF plans, the need for example, the requirement to have a pillar that was on policies for the next generation. And also we see on OECD research how many countries from the EU and from Europe in general, as we work on Europe, have tried to really implement and include young people's specific needs in their policies. But of course, way more could be done, as always. I think for us, the Year of Youth is a key moment for sure. And we need it to stay as a very important moment. We need the Year of Youth to have a legacy. It cannot be just a thing that happened this year and then we forget about it. So actually, from the European Youth Forum, one of our suggestions to make sure that this European Year of Youth has a concrete legacy is to implement something we've called the EU Youth Test, which is basically, to keep it short, an impact assessment tool that would ensure that young people, are considered during the policy-making processes within the European Union, and that we would then have an EU that would create better targeted policies that are impactful and that are beneficial for young people. And we can talk about that more in detail during the second part of the discussion. Something else that is really much linked to that is, and that was also quite clear in the results from the Eurobarometer, is the need to involve young people in the decision-making process and in the implementation of the measures. Young people through youth organizations, of course. We've seen once again some research from the OECD, a recent report that said that, of course, many of the measures were targeting young people, but at the end of the day, within the recovery plans that were drafted by the member states, very few had actually taken into account how young people could engage in the delivery of the recovery measures. And that is actually a very key point. You need young people to be engaged in that implementation. And we are really pushing for this, of course, as the European Youth Forum. And then maybe when we think of the more targeted approach, and we mentioned, of course, employment, education, mental health were three areas that were the most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis for young people. So it's all about quality, right? And Susanna was making this point also on employment. It's all about quality employment. We need to use the tools we already have, like the youth guarantee, for example. We need to have better entry-level jobs. We need to make sure that young workers have good working conditions. And once again, I'm giving an overview right now, and I'm happy to go more into details later on. It means we need to tackle low-paid jobs. We need to tackle temporary jobs, unpaid internships, precarious jobs like platform work. And the EU is actually taking measures in some of those areas. And so we really welcome this, and we hope, of course, even more for more involvement of young people in this. And then maybe to wrap up this and go to the discussion with the other speakers and from the participants also. It was said many times, mental health, it is a key issue. It was before, but it is even more of a key issue now. And we need to target it. And to target this, we need to have a holistic view. And I think there it is extremely important to understand the very important concrete links that there are between the mental health of young people and their socioeconomic environment. During COVID, many young people lost their job, lost their independence. They had to go back to living at home, maybe sometimes in spaces that are not safe for them. They lost on education. Everything was uncertain. That has an impact on your mental health, and that can have actually a very long-term impact then on your research of a job and on entering the labor market and on basically having a good life. So this is something, of course, that needs to be addressed in very targeted measures and in a holistic way. Always this double approach. And once again, would be really happy to talk more about this also with the other experts that really were targeting that point also. So that would be a first introduction from me. I hope I stayed within the time that was allocated, but really much looking forward to the following discussion between us to, kind of revisit those points and go further into what can be done.
Yes, thank you very much. And you did stay within the time. So thank you very much for this first reaction. And I look forward to seeing if other participants would like to also react. And I think that it was interesting to hear about everything that the European Youth Forum has been advocating for at the EU level to improve EU policies. So as you were mentioning, better targeted policies that are sustainable and long-term, and every year should be the year of youth, and we shouldn't only allocate it to 2022. And definitely, I think that the points around involving young people in decision-making processes and making sure that there is youth participation in our representative democracy with more participatory democracy methods would be key to this. But also, as you mentioned again, as the previous speakers, the effects of COVID-19 on the quality, on employment and mental health, and how it is important to have quality employment and not just employment and working conditions. And last but not least, also the importance of social environment. I think this was something that we brought also into the discussions. So now I would like to immediately start with the questions and answers from all of our speakers. And we have already received a few comments and a few questions. So I would like to start immediately with our participant, Karen, who says, I believe governments can help in subsidies for women who have lesser participation in the global digital market with infrastructures and skills building. So I would like to pass it first to Susanna and also to Massimiliano to discuss about the gender issue, maybe more in depth. And yes, would you like to comment also on what Karen said just now?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Karen. So absolutely, one of the things that we experience with the pandemic is the need for fiscal space to provide subsidies for the promotion of youth employment. And I will say from the analysis that the ILO has carried out, recovery measures, were many countries were very active in reacting to the crisis, but and not investments in youth employment were not at the top of the agenda, right? So now that 2 years after, if the recovery has been slow, and these kind of opportunities and opening fiscal space to support the participation and the quality of jobs for young people, it's important. We, as you say, we are talking specifically about young women. So provided that there is pro-employment macroeconomic policies to support subsidies. The other thing that I will add is that it is important also to think about how to entice the participation of young women in different programs or interventions. And in many cases, it's about providing additional support services like transportation or childcare, because many of these young women are also young mothers. So that the kind of tweaking and fine-tuning our interventions to think about what matters and what is important for young women to enter the labor market. Specifically, when we speak about the digital economy, of course, and we talk about investments, obviously, investing in infrastructure is crucial. And at the ILO, we have developed a model of intervention to promote and to boost decent jobs for youth in the digital economy that takes into account the supply side, as you brought in your question. So in how to boost the skills of young people, the digital skills, and generally the skills that the digital economy needs. But it is also a matter of boosting the labor demand, working with employers so that we open space for them to absorb that labor force. So there is more to say. I will pause there and give space for my co-panelist.
Thank you. Massimiliano? Your microphone, Massimiliano? Thanks.
Sorry, it went to mute, actually. Young women, especially those with young children, are the social group that suffered the most the COVID-19 crisis. And this because at the beginning of the crisis, when we all went teleworking, actually, there was also a campaign with the closure of schools and the closure of crashes, actually. So this created a kind of a perfect storm due to the unequal distribution of homeworks between men and women. So it exacerbates, again, these gender inequalities in domestic care and so on, and especially in care. So it is very important actually to work in order to address this. And how actually we can address gender gaps actually in general. In several ways, but if we talk about needs, we see that, young people are not in employment, education, and training for several reasons. One of them is family responsibilities. Now, according to our latest studies, 1/5, so the 20% of needs are not in employment, education, and training because they need to take care of their own families, which means children and or adults. This 20% is composed almost totally by young women. So if we wanted to start fighting gender equality, we could start from here. And how actually we could do it? Of course, with subsidies for integration in the labor market. But if you want a more long-lasting change, actually, we need to start to invest in social infrastructure. So crashes, childcare, and this type of support that can allow every woman to have the opportunity to decide if they want to take care of children at home or not, actually. And in case they have the opportunity to go to enter into the labor market. So it is important to work in this and provide the social infrastructure in our member states to broaden these opportunities.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. I think that this was touching upon my own personal situation with a 2-year-old that was born during COVID. So I can completely relate to the importance of social structures that support, taking care of our children during especially these exceptional times. But now moving forward, I have a couple of questions actually from Manon. So I will read them out. One is from Chiara. Based on the ILO Global Report on Youth and COVID-19, over 1 in 4 youth reported actively engaging in volunteerism, so 31%, and in making donations towards COVID-19 responses, 27%. So the question is, how can governments and policymakers bring the voices of young people to decision-making processes? And what else could be done in order to boost youth engagement in Europe? And I will give you also the second question from Laura, which was to explain more the impact assessment tool, if you can. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Elisa. Well, I think regarding really the involvement of young people, we need, of course, to recognize that there are already mechanisms that exist, such as the EU Youth Dialogue. There are right now policy dialogues happening with the commissioners that are reaching out to different young people all across Europe on very specific topics. So that's been already really positive, of course. Of course, as always, more can be done. It has to be, if you want, a very constant and systematic involvement of young people and through usually youth organizations in the development of any policies that we know will impact young people. And that's why we were talking about this impact assessment tool, because that's a really concrete way to do this in a very systematic way. So to explain this tool, it would be something that happens in 3 steps. So basically, every new law and policy would be assessed for its impact on youth at a basic level with a very simple framework. There would be first a quick assessment. If that shows that would have a potential impact on youth, whatever it could be, then there would be a consultation with young stakeholders, young experts in the field of that policy. The third step then would be that if this impact would be negative on young people at large or on a certain group of young people, then we would have to appropriate some mitigation measures that would have to be put in place before the new law or the policy is launched. So those 3 steps would make up the youth test, and it would have to be done for all legislation and policies that are being drafted. We know several member states have some sort of youth test already, and that would be really, as I was saying, this legacy for the year of youth, but just a very, very concrete way of involving young people in decision-making process, and in making sure that any policy that is taken has a positive impact only on young people. It's quite similar, of course, to what happens also with the gender mainstreaming, for example, if you want to understand it better, maybe if you're more familiar with this. So that would be really a great way to involve young people. And then, of course, there's the issue of voting in general. We do advocate for vote at 16, as we say, from the European Youth Forum. That's another bigger question. That's another way, as Biliana was talking about the Eurobarometer responses and how voting was still very high on priorities for young people. That is something also we can explore in general.
Thank you very much. On this last note, I think that there is a big debate about voting at 16. We actually manage the European Citizens Initiative Forum, and we've been fighting for a long time to lower also the signing of the European Citizens Initiative for 16 years old. And actually, I would like to follow up with Biliana, maybe more about this aspect of participation of youth, but also around the question that I received from Watson around young people should participate in government decisions. And if you can comment more about maybe how they can participate and what are the expectations that young people might have when they actually do participate, and how can policymakers meet these expectations as well?
Sure. Thank you very much, Elisa. I would like to sneak something in while I have the floor, because it's linked to the previous discussion about addressing, unemployment, and want to mention that a concrete solution that we have provided at the EU level really quite recently, last month, it's a new program. It's called ALMA. So it stands for Aim, Learn, Master, Achieve. And this program is targeting exactly disadvantaged needs, aged 18 to 30, who are most vulnerable, and increasing really their chances of later accessing work. So what this program is, it's active inclusion scheme. and it's a supervised stay abroad for a period of 2 to 6 months, where the young people are coached and counseled. There is a full comprehensive project cycle with the ultimate objective to help them boost their skills and to, once they are back in their home country, to be able to integrate on the job market. So this is something that it's really very new, and I encourage also everyone to find out more about this. But on youth participation, I would like to mention that, of course, this is a very big objective of the European Year of Youth. And importantly, because the European Year of Youth, it's a commitment from all levels, from literally the local level to the national and the European. And so there, at all the levels, it's important to see how we can implicate young people more in all kinds of decision and policy-making processes, from really decisions in their school to their community, to their government, etc. So I want to stress that there are so many initiatives that are happening at the other levels that are amazing, and all kinds of steering groups where young people are part of the process, advisory boards. At the EU level, I can mention, Manon referred to them, for instance, these policy dialogues with commissioners. And just last week, we had actually a policy dialogue with Commissioner Schmidt, which was on minimum income and social protection, because we were talking about, it's close to the topics we're discussing. So young people are debating these issues with the commissioner. And because we are in the process of developing a new directive on minimum income, their input is taken into consideration in development of this directive. So this is, I think, a very good example of how we want to enable young people to participate more. And there are also larger scale projects. I mentioned this Youth Voices platform, where we invite all of you who are listening to record your key insights or messages or what proposals and ideas, and this will be analyzed and acted upon. So this is what I can say here. Thanks, Elisa.
Thank you very much for these concrete examples as well, and all of the things that the EU is doing. And I would actually like to ask more about employment and the situation of employment to Susanna, because we've received a very interesting question. So this can be also referred to all speakers, but you all mentioned the importance of mental well-being. So which role does the private sector play in this regard, and how governments can ensure the engagement of the private sector in promoting better quality jobs? Susanna?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely, a very, very important role. The private sector is the creator of jobs, right? So, and what we see very often in our economies is that there are some challenges in education, but in general, young people have access to skills and opportunities to upskill and reskill. Yet, employers often mention that young people are still missing some key skills, soft skills, what at the ILO we call core skills, core work skills. So it is important for the private sector then to identify what are those gaps, so that we can, jointly governments and education, the skills development institutions can work with employers in addressing those gaps from the skills side. At the same time, it is important for employers to help shape the education agenda, so that we reduce the disconnect between the supply and the demand. And last but not least, it is important to keep insisting on job creation, because otherwise we will have a lot of young people, continue having an increased number of young people that have graduated but are not able to find a job, right? Or are not able to transition into a decent job and just simply start working in jobs that are what we call underemployment. No, these are jobs that are not at the level of their skills, nor, let's say, the dream. Having said that, it is also important, and this is a responsibility of the private sector as much as of every one of us, to keep an eye on the rights and the voices of young people, so that it is an agenda that is comprehensive and that truly, brings everybody together, from employers organizations, workers organizations, governments, and young people.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And while we're on still the topic of employment, maybe I'll ask Massimiliano one of the questions that has reached us. What are the key reasons that policy efforts haven't given a high enough priority to addressing the COVID impacts on youth and unemployment?
Yes, thanks a lot, Elisa. Actually, I think that probably is not high enough priority. I think that our decision makers actually found themselves in March 2020 with an unprecedented situation. It was the worst economic and social crisis in memory, basically, in history. And it was over the last decades. So the priority that decision maker put actually were really saving lives, or try to save lives, and taking care of the economy. In order to do that, they implemented non-pharmaceutical interventions, and then they tried and they started to provide a lot of support with a very different policy response in comparison to the 2008 crisis. In order to do that, the priority was job retention. So with the SURE mechanism and the short-time working scheme, they were trying to save jobs. And I would say that in this perspective, it was quite successful. If we see actually the rates of employment or unemployment now, it was quite successful. However, the more that we move forward, the more that appears the needs of different actions. And it is now the time to see what has been the impact of that crisis, who are the population that suffered the most, and for sure, youth has been that, and what are the results of the exacerbation of inequalities in our society, and then move from here. In this regard, I said at the beginning, this holistic approach, and this would mean just move on youth employment, but also taking care of the mental health issues that can happen during the crisis, whose effect may linger long, actually after the end of the crisis. And then other aspects that are fundamental for young people transition towards their adult life, actually. And this is housing. Housing is a strong chapter where young people is facing a lot of problems, because the prices of houses have skyrocketed also as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And then now affordability of mortgages to actually buy a house or also rent in some member states is very difficult for young people. So we observe in some countries this boomerang generation, young people that is coming back to their own parental house. And this is not what we wanted in a modern Europe, actually. So we need to ease access to housing for young people in order to leave a parental home and start their adult life as soon as possible, as soon as they want, actually. But let's ensure that everyone has this opportunity. And this is another chapter to policy intervention now and in the near future. And but we have a problem in the future. And the problem is the cost of living, Ukraine, and so on. So let's see how it goes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Massimiliano. Everything you say today is very relatable to my own situation about mortgages and buying houses as well. For a young person, it's become very difficult. But now moving on, I would like to actually hear from Biljana's point of view and maybe some reactions to the things that were said, but also another question that we received from Selam. Any efforts made or strategies in place that can help youth that are unemployed but active, for example, volunteering, to transition to more of a gainful employment? Biljana, and then I'll pass it also to Manon. Maybe she has some things to say about it too.
Yes, absolutely. I think both at the national level and definitely the European there is this recognition that volunteering is actually a very good way for young people to develop their skills, which we were talking about previously, to gain experience, including work experience, to make connections, etc. So this is all linked to them being more employable and developing as well. And so a number of things, but at the EU level, the most recent one is a new council recommendation on the mobility of volunteers. Because, okay, we are talking about volunteering in the country, and there are sometimes national schemes, but also we want to encourage the mobility of volunteers abroad. So apart from the value that they get from the volunteering experience, they also get the value from the mobility and the transnational character of the activity. So in these recommendations, there are a number of guidelines for both member states and different stakeholders on how to make this experience useful. And so, for instance, one thing is this recognition. So once volunteers are engaged in that experience, which is a non-formal experience, are these skills and knowledge that they are gaining being recognized? Is it when they put it on their CV, is it something that employers recognize? And in this Eurobarometer that we recently did, there was a question actually. When you did a volunteering, was this experience, did you receive some kind of a certificate? That was the question. And actually in 40, something like close to half of the people, they did not. So this is one thing that we can clearly do on this recognition of that experience so that it counts and it can be useful and recognized for employability.
Thank you very much, Biljana. I actually think that this would be a very important for people to prove that their time and effort were put on these volunteering experience and that they can showcase what they've done. And sometimes, yes, something so simple as that actually is missing. So I would actually like to hear also the reaction from Manon on this. And maybe, Manon, you can also answer a question from Anya about the Youth Guarantee Program. And if we are seeing all those challenges and the need for more comprehensive support, then why is the Youth Guarantee so rigid and offers a limited basket of services? And so maybe you can give us a bit more insight on how this Youth Guarantee works and how it can really support.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elisa. I mean, on the previous point, I don't have much to add, actually, because I think Biljana was really clear and in the need for the recognition of the volunteer work, through certificates or whatever. That's really what's the most important, to then make sure that there's a seamless transition from this volunteer work to perhaps employment then. On the youth guarantee, I mean, I did mention it. We do think it is a positive tool, of course, depending on how it's implemented. And, there's been work by the Commission to reinforce it. There was this reinforced youth guarantee. I think it's been 2 years now that it was really worked on. But something, of course, that was missing on our side is the amount of quality offers. Then it's really regarding the implementation. And there, we've been really pushing for quality standards for the youth guarantee. We do have actually a list of quality standards that would make sure that the offers that the young people have will actually guarantee quality employment and then long-term, a quality career in general. That's something that is missing for now, and we've been also trying to talk with the Commission about this. So we hope, we'll take further steps regarding this to make sure that the youth guarantee, that is a great tool, is used at its best potential. Because, of course, there's always positive in having new instruments and new tools that are maybe more targeted, but the youth guarantee is such a general tool at the beginning that we really want to make sure that it reaches its best potential for young people all across Europe, especially in this I was going to say post-COVID recovery, but we're still in the pandemic, so in this recovery phase.
Thank you very much, Manon. And as we're coming to the end of this webinar, I would just like to ask one last question that we received. And maybe Massimiliano, you could answer this question from Laura. Could you please explain and give numbers of the situation of young people with disabilities during their multidimensional crisis and the impact in their employment rate? Then Massimiliano, if you could also start wrapping up your conclusions on possible way forward for ensuring youth higher standards of youth employment and etc.
Yes, thanks a lot. Yes, I was computing it in real time actually, and we found that around 15% of young people actually has problems in terms of disabilities to carry out the normal life actually at the end every day. So it's quite an high share actually this, and unfortunately, as all the vulnerable population. The population of people with disabilities as those that have suffered the most during the COVID-19 crisis, for the lockdown, for the labor market participation, and so on. If entering in the labor market was already difficult for young people with disabilities, before the pandemic, it became practically impossible during COVID-19. So this is something that needed to be addressed, and attention to these vulnerable groups is something that we need to build in the post-COVID crisis, the post-COVID recovery. Now, in order to wrap up, actually, of course, I will take inspiration from here. First of all, we need in this recovery to address inequalities has been exacerbated. We see very well what are those groups that suffer the most. So there is where we need to intervene in the post-COVID recovery, addressing these inequalities, people with disabilities, low skilled actually, those at the margin. It was impossible. It was very difficult to find a job before. During the crisis, those who were unemployed didn't find a job, and we needed to address this situation. Finally, housing. Again, I read that in Ireland now the average wage that is needed in order to buy a house is 85,000 euros a year. This is impossible for a young people that is just entering in the labor market. We have a surreal situation. Young people has much more wealth, access to wealth than in the past for goods and services, but not for housing. It is important that we address these in order to allow anyone to have access to decent housing as well as decent employment with good salaries. Thanks a lot. It's over from me.
Thank you very much. Susanna, do you agree with Massimiliano? And what are your concluding points to this webinar?
Thank you, Lisa. Of course, I agree with Massi. And to truly make it really short in my closing, I want to call attention again to those three elements I mentioned before. No, let's together explore how we can come up with more and better solutions to integrate to support the integration and participation of young women in the labor market. Let's make sure that mental well-being is not something that is a taboo or that is is not spoken about, but that we can find very direct and explicit ways to integrate mental well solutions and plans within our programming and policing. And the last is about the rights and the voices of young people. How can we continue enhancing this participation of young people, clearly in Europe, but also my call is global. And to the young people that are there listening and those that will watch this later, of course, the picture is a little bit bleak, but I will say, please make sure you maintain your positivity, because we need your ideas and we need your solutions. Surround yourself with networks and support at work and at home, and make sure your voice is raised through the venues you have at your disposal. You do have the possibility of influencing policy and advocating for decent work for all. And we look forward to having your voices at the ILO, surely Eurofound, at the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Now, Biljana, we are interested in knowing more about the European Commission and what are your concluding remarks on future EU policies that could tackle everything that we've been discussing today.
Thanks, Elisa. So, yes, to think about the solutions, I think I want to highlight just three things. And there is a bit of overlap, of course, with the previous speakers, because we do agree on really all of the points. And the first one is that I think we can see how the evidence is very important here. So we have to have this evidence-based policies And this is why it's valuable to continue to survey people, to have the data. And if I can add to that, we discussed some things like gender, but I saw a comment mention about disabilities and different backgrounds, young people from migrant backgrounds. So in looking at the data, I think, and finding the right solutions, we also have to always keep in mind that young people are not homogeneous group, and there are very particular needs for some groups of young people. So I think we have to use that approach and always keep that perspective. The second one is that, in some of the slides I was sharing how there's a really big differences between some member states and the different levels. So I think in our finding the solutions, clearly it has to be targeted to the right context and the right level. In places where some of the basic needs of young people, like housing, are not met, and people have issues such as fighting poverty, precariousness, they don't have jobs, etc. They cannot be thinking about participation in EU decision making and some of these nice things. I mean, it's almost like, you've heard the Maslow pyramid of needs. Some of these basic needs have to be satisfied. So the actions have to be local and really targeted. And the final point is really what Susanna was mentioning, this youth participation, because who better knows the needs than the young people themselves? So clearly they have to very much involved in developing the solutions. We discussed some of these, how we can do that. There can be done more. And yes, final say, I mean, Susanna mentioned voice their ideas. In the European Year of Youth, we say that young people should voice their vision. This is the motto for our Youth Voices platform. So I want to add with just an encouragement for all young people to check it and tell us what their ideas are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liliana. And last but not least, Manon, is there anything missing from all of these concluding remarks?
Well, not much missing for sure. I mean, it's really great to be in this panel where we all agree on the key points there. I think maybe to reiterate, I think there's a great need to look at the situation holistically, to have policies that look at all the different causes together and not try only to, I mean, as I was saying, the targeted ones, and then the bigger vision and the bigger picture of how, mental health is linked with the socioeconomic environment and how we can work on all of that together. And then also so great to see so much agreement on the need for young people's involvement and participation. I mean, of course, that's something that we'll always be advocating for. I will also always invite young people to, if they can and if they want to join youth organizations, the more the better that we are and that we can represent you towards the EU and other institutions. But yeah, I think that was a great discussion, and there's always more. We can then continue the discussion all together and in different events and with our friends and at home and all of this. So thank you again very much for this.
That's great. Well, this wraps up our event for today. And of course, we've been discussing about so many topics, from social support structures, housing, mental well-being, quality employment, quality conditions for young people working, and also their rights should be ensured in these workplaces. The importance, as Liliana was mentioning, about data, constantly getting data and having evidence-based data in order to understand what are the issues in external circumstances, such as the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, and how this impacts on young people's trust in government, mental, physical health, and everything else. And I also think that it is very important to, as was said, to find the solutions for the right context and the right level, tailor-made solutions. There is no silver bullet. And of course, everything that is regarding the importance of young people's participation. So I urge everyone to join the platform and to voice your vision as a young person, because policymakers are also here to listen to, not only policymakers, also civil society. And as Manon was saying, if you're a young person, best way to start and to be active is to join a youth organization. As I myself started very young, and it has brought so many benefits in also participating in society and also creating a community together. So thank you once again for joining us. This was an event, a collaboration between Eurofound, the European Commission, and the International Labour Organization. Thanks again to all of the experts, all of the speakers, and to the participants for the interactive session. And we hope to see you in our next webinar. Thank you.